was envisioned as a city worthy of a nation. A place of great democratic institutions, grand public spaces, and elegant city streets, all along a river connecting it to the outside world. Today, that vision is a reality and has made Washington, D.C. one of the most distinctive cities in America. But the journey of the nation's capital has not been easy. Less than 25 years after it was founded, invading troops nearly burned it to the ground. Later, during the Civil War, Washington became one of the most fortified cities in the world. Over the years, assassinations, major scandals, mass protests, and political battles have rocked its core. But through it all, Washington, D.C. has persevered with its stunning landmarks, some of the most visited museums in the world, and memorials where the sacrifices of tens of thousands are still remembered today. From the U.S. troops who fought to bring an end to World War II, to a president who managed to unite a divided nation, to a man whose battle for civil rights has empowered millions. But there's much more to this city than its monuments. Its neighborhoods thrive. Its majestic waters still beckon. And it's home to a team with one of the most controversial names in professional sports. A famous writer once called it a city of magnificent intentions. This is the colorful story of Washington, D.C. From a distance, the skyline of Washington, D.C. has very few distinctive features. There are no modern towers of glass and steel glimmering on its skyline. The only structure that truly stands out is the soaring spire of the Washington Monument as it reaches for the sky against the cool blue waters of the Potomac River. It's part of what makes Washington, D.C. such a unique city. Many of its greatest buildings and institutions are not impressive for their awe-inspiring size, but for their history, purpose, and what happens inside their walls. And sometimes, the best way to discover what the nation's capital is all about is to explore it from above. Every Friday in the summer, the U.S. Marine Band gets ready to put on a show here at the Marine Barracks at 8th and I Streets. It's a sight that few people ever get to see from the air. This is the oldest continuously active post of the U.S. Marine Corps and is home to some of the Marines' most specialized units, from its drum and bugle corps to its color guard to its body bearers. Thomas Jefferson chose this location for the barracks because it was an easy march to the capital. It was also close to the Washington Navy Yard. Established in 1799, it was once the U.S. Navy's largest shipbuilding facility. Today, it's home to the USS Barry. This Navy destroyer was part of the large naval quarantine of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis and was deployed to fire on Viet Cong positions along the Saigon River during the Vietnam War. The men stationed here at the Navy Yard and at the Marine Barracks saw little to no action in Washington, D.C.'s first few years. But it wouldn't be long before they would be fighting for the very survival of the nation, right here in the capital itself. On a swelteringly hot day in late August 1814, more than 4,000 British troops arrived here on the banks of the Anacostia River in Bladensburg, Maryland, where this pedestrian bridge now stands. A hastily assembled American militia, together with 1,000 regulars from the Army, Navy, and Marines, tried to keep the British troops at bay. But the militiamen were disorganized and poorly trained and were quickly overrun. Their humiliating defeat on August 24, 1814, is known as the Battle of Bladensburg. The British pushed on towards the city. They headed straight for the U.S. Capitol building. When they arrived, they found the Houses of Congress abandoned. Fearing for their lives, President James Madison, his government, and 90% of the city's population had fled D.C. There was no one to stop the British from piling up furniture and books and setting the building on fire. Less than 40 years after America's independence, its new capital was already being attacked and destroyed. As the Houses of Congress burned, the troops marched up Pennsylvania Avenue to the president's mansion. Inside, they are said to have found the table set for 40 guests, meat still roasting on the spit, and glasses filled with fine wine. They dined heartily and then piled up furniture and linens and set the president's house ablaze as well. Soon, many of D.C.'s most important government buildings were engulfed in flames. It's said the fires could be seen from up to 70 miles away. The British captured, but then spared the Marine barracks, reportedly out of respect for the courage the Marines had shown on the battlefield in Bladensburg. The fires all over Washington, D.C. stopped burning only because a freak hurricane-force storm swept in and doused the flames. A tornado also wreaked havoc on the residents of the city, destroying their homes, uprooting trees, and turning vast stretches of Washington into a wasteland. But by then, with their mission to humiliate the U.S. government accomplished, the British were gone, and the Americans were left to rebuild their nation's capital all over again. Three weeks later, in September 1814, the Star-Spangled Banner was raised above Fort McHenry to signal America's successful defense of Baltimore, which helped bring an end to the War of 1812. That famous American flag, more than 40 feet long, is now permanently on display here inside the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. A replica hangs outside. There's nothing like seeing Washington, D.C.'s National Mall from the air. Every year, this one national park draws roughly 25 million visitors, more than 3 times as many as Yellowstone and Yosemite combined. It's home to 3 of D.C.'s most visited sites: the National Museum of Natural History, with its great halls for mammals, fossils, and creatures of the sea; the National Air and Space Museum, where visitors come to learn about everything from the Wright brothers to moon dust to the latest high-tech drones; and the National Museum of American History. Once cows grazed on the land where these museums now stand. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the land in front of the U.S. Capitol was cleared and the National Mall, as we know it today, was born. The mall begins here at the U.S. Capitol Reflecting Pool and runs right up to the Washington Monument. But many of D.C.'s most moving sights lie past the monument to the west. There's the Korean War Veterans Memorial, where steel figures move through fields on patrol to honor the roughly 1.5 million American servicemen and women who served in that war. Nearby lies the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, designed by 21-year-old architecture student Maya Lin. Its black granite slabs are carved with the names of more than 58,000 soldiers who died in the Vietnam War. It's one of Washington, D.C.'s most visited sites, and is the only memorial where visitors can leave objects of remembrance. One group of veterans left a Harley-Davidson motorcycle here to honor their fallen brothers. on its license plate was one word: hero. Nestled in the middle is the National World War II Memorial, which is marked by a pair of victory pavilions. They are dedicated to those who fought to win the war's Pacific and Atlantic campaigns. It was planned to preserve the view down the mall and then all the way across the reflecting pool of the majestic Lincoln Memorial. Designed in the style of a Greek temple, it has 36 Doric columns to symbolize the 36 U.S. states that existed at the time of Lincoln's assassination in 1865. A memorial to honor Lincoln was proposed shortly after his death, but it took 55 years to fund and complete. His famous Gettysburg Address is etched on its walls. But the biggest draw is what lies inside. A towering marble statue of Lincoln himself, in a pensive pose, gazing out across the memorial's long reflecting pool, towards the Capitol and across a city that has changed dramatically since it was founded more than 2 centuries ago. To understand how Washington, D.C. went from being just an idea to the impressive city it is today requires a trip up the Potomac River to a site that lies 14 miles away from where the Lincoln Memorial now stands. It's a place known as Great Falls. Here, the waters of the Potomac River start a dramatic 76-foot descent on their way to Chesapeake Bay. Long before any Europeans set eyes on these rushing waters, members of the Powhatan and Iroquois tribes once used the land around the falls as a meeting place. In 1608, English Captain John Smith traveled up the Potomac, but could only reach the falls on foot. And that's also why the English traders who followed him ended up parking their canoes downriver and trading with Indian tribes that lived in a village that once stood here, at the end of what's now Washington's Key Bridge. That Iroquois village was called Tahoga, but would be known to the world as Georgetown, after Maryland established a port here in 1751. Ships and bustling docks lined its waterfront. Most of Georgetown's many historic buildings date back to after the Revolutionary War. But there is still one structure left from the town's earliest days. It's called the Old Stone House and was built by a cabinet maker in 1765 from locally quarried blue granite. It's now the oldest standing building in Washington, D.C. It was partly because of the success of Georgetown that the land around the port was chosen as the site for the new United States Capitol. When the U.S. Constitution was signed in 1787, it authorized the establishment of a new federal district for the new nation. 3 years later, in 1790, President George Washington was given permission to choose the actual site. A potential location was identified here at the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. It lay between the already thriving port cities of Alexandria, Virginia, and Georgetown, Maryland. And it was also conveniently right in the middle of the northern and southern states. At the time, much of present-day Washington itself was covered with low hills and trees. It probably looked a lot like this stretch of the Potomac River today. But in the late 18th century, the region around the Potomac wasn't exactly wild. Flanking both banks of the river were farms and plantations, many of which had been here for more than a century. One of the largest belonged to George Washington himself. It's known as Mount Vernon and stands on a spot high above the Potomac River south of Alexandria. Washington's Grand House is now a museum. As a teenager, George Washington had surveyed and created the first maps of what became the city of Alexandria. Later, it was from Alexandria's port that he exported wheat and other products from Mount Vernon. He knew that this port and the port of Georgetown on the opposite bank of the river would be useful assets to the nation's new capital. Placing it on the Potomac would also provide an important access route to the Ohio Valley, which could help the nation expand to the west. Washington finally decided to establish the new district and its 10-mile square right over the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. Maryland and Virginia would both provide the land and turn over their ports of Georgetown and Alexandria. Washington then hired a French artist and engineer named Pierre L'Enfant to design a plan for a new capital. L'Enfant clashed with local officials, and Thomas Jefferson asked him to resign from the job before his plans were built. But much of his original vision for the nation's capital remains amazingly intact today. Just a few blocks from the White House, here in Freedom Plaza, part of Washington, D.C.'s original street plan has been laid out in marble and granite for all to see and to walk on. It's anything but the standardized grid of streets that are found in many other American cities. He placed Congress on a hill he called a pedestal waiting for a monument, which is Capitol Hill today. And he imagined a grand tree-lined avenue that would connect the Capitol to the President's house. That's now Pennsylvania Avenue and carries every elected U.S. president to the White House after their inauguration. The plan also called for the President's house to be surrounded by a large park. L'Enfant imagined a city full of green, open spaces. Some would be sites to honor important figures of the day. They are the lifeblood of many of Washington's neighborhoods, especially this one, DuPont Circle. Once, this area was pretty much out in the suburbs. Only the wealthy could afford to live out here and own the horses needed to travel into town. These days, DuPont Circle lies right in the center of the city. From here, great avenues radiate out across Washington like giant spokes, creating the street plan that may be L'Enfant's greatest contribution to Washington, D.C. On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 people gathered around the Lincoln Memorial's reflecting pool for the famous March on Washington. At the end of the march, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the memorial steps and gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. With a firm, unwavering voice, he called on the U.S. government to follow through on its promise to guarantee all American citizens, black and white, the same inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The very next year, Congress passed the historic 1964 Civil Rights Act, which President Lyndon B. Johnson then signed into law. Today, a memorial to King stands on the banks of the tidal basin, just steps from the site of his most famous speech. The idea of a towering monument to an African American was unimaginable in D.C.'s early years. Just over a century before the March on Washington, thousands of African Americans were still living and working in the nation's capital as slaves. In fact, slave labor built much of the original city. Enslaved men did the back-breaking work of quarrying stone for the White House. They also sawed lumber, hauled bricks, constructed walls, plastered and painted many of D.C.'s early government buildings, including the U.S. Capitol. 10 of the first 12 U.S. presidents owned slaves, and some even brought them to work in the White House. It was common to see lines of shackled African Americans being led through D.C.'s streets as slave dealers marched them from one place to another. By 1860, there were more than 3,000 slaves in Washington. In fact, it was the issue of slavery back in the 1840s that helped transform the original size of D.C. from what was authorized in the Constitution to the much smaller boundaries it has today. George Washington may have envisioned it as a perfect 10-mile square, but it didn't end up that way. The problem was, the city of Alexandria, which was then part of the District of Columbia, was at the heart of a booming trade in slaves. One of the largest human trafficking businesses in America at the time took place in this building, now known as Freedom House. Up to 1,800 slaves were sent from here to Louisiana and Mississippi every year. By the 1840s, pressure was mounting on Capitol Hill to ban slavery in the district. But Southern congressmen fought to keep Alexandria's booming slave trade intact and argued that the city be returned to the pro-slavery state of Virginia. Finally, Congress gave in and carved off Alexandria and all the land west of the Potomac River and gave it back to Virginia. And that's how D.C. went from being a square to being the odd shape it is today. 16 years later, on April 16, 1862, President Lincoln finally did outlaw slavery in Washington. Existing slaves were set free, and slave owners were paid by the government for their loss. By then, the Civil War was raging, and D.C. was caught between two pro-slavery states. The only fort protecting it was one that stood here, at Fort Washington, south of the city. The U.S. government launched a massive campaign to defend Washington. Union troops set about building 68 new forts all around the city. By 1865, they had turned the almost defenseless capital into one of the most fortified cities in the world. One of the new forts was Fort Stevens, which now lies in northwest Washington, D.C. In early July 1864, Confederate General Jubal Early and 12,000 of his troops began an assault on the nation's capital. Fort Stevens was where D.C.'s Union forces gathered to defend the city. Many in Congress had already left town, but on July 12th, President Lincoln arrived at Fort Stevens to observe the fighting. He climbed up onto the ramparts here, near where this stone marker now stands. But when a Confederate sharpshooter shot a Union Army surgeon nearby, General Horatio Wright ordered Lincoln to take cover. "Mr. President, you are too conspicuous an object to remain in so exposed a position," he is reported to have said. Lincoln obeyed the orders and dropped down into the trenches. The battle ended when the Confederates gave up and slipped out of D.C. under the cover of darkness. 9 months later, the Civil War was over. The U.S. Army's defenses had succeeded in keeping D.C. safely in Union hands. And on April 11, 1865, President Lincoln addressed a joyful crowd from the window directly over the main door of the White House. In the audience was a well-known actor named John Wilkes Booth. Booth believed that the president's anti-slavery policies would destroy the South. He and a number of conspirators had already been plotting to kidnap the president. But infuriated by Lincoln's speeches and the Confederate surrender, their plan turned to murder. The next night, President Lincoln and First Lady Mary Todd made their way here to Ford's Theater, a few blocks away from the White House, to see a play. Their security detail consisted of just one D.C. police officer named John Parker. But during the play, Parker left his post and headed off for a drink at the Star Saloon next door. Meanwhile, Booth waited for a moment of laughter and applause and then crept into the president's box and fired a fatal shot to the back of his head. When he leapt to the stage, he fell and broke his leg, but managed to limp out a back door to this alley where he had a saddled horse waiting. These days, the Secret Service would have locked down D.C.'s streets, but in 1865, Booth was able to gallop right across Washington and escape via a bridge over the Anacostia River. "I rode 60 miles that night with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump," he scribbled in a diary he kept while he was on the run. Booth was confident that if he could reach Virginia, he would be embraced by Southern sympathizers. He met up with a co-conspirator named David Harold, who was supposed to lead him to safety. First, they picked up guns and supplies at this tavern in Maryland, which was owned by a landlady named Mary Surratt. Then they rode to the house of a doctor named Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's broken leg. The fugitives' next stop was a visit to Samuel Cox, a Southern sympathizer. But Cox was worried about harboring the men, so he sent them off to the woods nearby. Meanwhile, Booth's other co-conspirators had been caught, and federal troops were now combing the countryside, searching for Lincoln's shooter. After 9 days on the run, President Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, and co-conspirator David Harold finally left their camp in the trees and paddled across the Potomac River into Virginia. But federal forces were hot on their tail. In his diary, Booth wrote, "After being hunted like a dog through swamps, I am here in despair. Tonight I try to escape these bloodhounds once more. I have too great a soul to die like a criminal." But it was here in Virginia that U.S. soldiers finally caught up with the two men, and as the sun was rising, a young soldier shot Booth dead. The assassin's body was brought back to Washington, to Fort McNair, which lies at the confluence of the Anacostia and Potomac rivers. He was buried here, 10 feet underground in a storage room, inside what was the U.S. government's first federal penitentiary. It's also where Booth's co-conspirators were held and tried. Grant Hall is the only building from the penitentiary that's still standing. On July 7, 1865, the 4 conspirators were hanged just outside Grant Hall, on land that's now covered with tennis courts. One of those was Mary Surratt, the owner of the boarding house where the conspirators had met to plan their crime. She was the first woman ever to be executed by the U.S. government. Lincoln wasn't the last U.S. president to be assassinated in Washington, D.C. 16 years later, on July 2, 1881, President James Garfield was shot by an assassin in the old train station that used to stand here on the National Mall. He later died from the infection of his wounds, which modern-day doctors believe could have easily been prevented. 3 other presidents in Washington survived attempted assassinations: Andrew Jackson in 1835, Harry S. Truman in 1950, and Ronald Reagan on March 30th, 1981. Reagan was waving to a crowd here outside the portico of the Washington Hilton when John Hinckley Jr. stepped forward and fired multiple rounds. A bullet ricocheted off a car and hit Reagan in the ribs. The Secret Service diverted the presidential limousine to George Washington University Hospital nearby. The president is reported to have told First Lady Nancy Reagan, "Honey, I forgot to duck," when she arrived at his bedside. But one of Hinckley's 6 bullets had hit Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, in the head, paralyzing him and leaving him with extensive brain damage. Brady died in 2014 of complications from his injuries. Hinckley used a guilty by reason of insanity defense and won. He was committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, right here in Washington, where he still is today. He claimed he shot Reagan to try and impress actress Jodie Foster, with whom he was obsessed. Real-life drama has pervaded Washington, D.C.'s history almost since the day it was founded. It's one reason why the fictional television series House of Cards, about powerful members of Congress, is such a hit. But one of the most fascinating tales in D.C. is the real story of how the U.S. government managed to lose, literally, a fortune in gold during the creation of the Smithsonian Institution. In 1829, an amateur English scientist named James Smithson died and left the equivalent of $508,000 in gold to the United States government, even though he'd never set foot in America. Smithson said his fortune had to be used to create what he called an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, and he wanted it named after himself. The U.S. government accepted the gift, and it arrived as 105 sacks of English gold sovereigns, which were then melted down in Philadelphia to make $10 U.S. coins. The value of Smithson's gift was worth nearly 15 times the annual budget of the United States. But amazingly, the government then managed to lose Smithson's fortune. It invested the $500,000 worth of gold in Arkansas and Michigan state bonds that went bust. But in 1846, the U.S. Congress decided to go ahead and create the Smithsonian Institution anyway. It also commissioned its first building, the castle. Over the years, its treasures have grown exponentially, thanks in part to a wide variety of donations, from scientific collections to works of art. One of those came from a railroad manufacturer from Detroit, who donated about 7,500 objects of art to create the Freer Gallery in 1906. With its courtyard open to the sky and famous Peacock Room painted entirely by artist James McNeill Whistler, it's one of the most unique museums on the National Mall. Today, there are 19 Smithsonian museums and 9 research centers around the world, including an entire island in Panama and the new National Museum of African American History and Culture that's rising on the last available space on the National Mall. Even today, thousands of new objects flood into the Smithsonian's collections every year. But even with all its museums in Washington, there's still not enough space to house them. And that's why up to 40% of its treasures have to be stored outside of D.C. in this nondescript facility in Maryland. It was featured in the Dan Brown novel, The Lost Symbol. Inside are skulls of elephants, the jaws of whales, vast collections of mosquitoes and jellyfish, along with more than 50 million other objects. But some objects are so big, they need their own giant hangars. That's why the National Air and Space Museum opened its Udvar Hazy Center in 2003 here at Dulles International Airport in Virginia. Lurking inside is the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest jet aircraft in the world. To get to the museum, the jet flew from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in 1 hour, 4 minutes, and 20 seconds at more than 2,000 miles per hour. When it finally touched down here at Dulles, the pilot had to deploy a chute to keep the plane from racing right off the end of the runway. Even the Smithsonian's National Zoo has grown too big for Washington. Some of its most fascinating and endangered creatures now live 50 miles away in Virginia. This is the Smithsonian's Conservation Biology Institute at Front Royal. One of the species here are the Przewalski horses, or pea horses for short. These animals are native to Mongolia and China and are considered the world's last truly wild horses. But they are also critically endangered. Nearby are some of the fastest land animals on the planet, at least when they're chasing prey. These are a few of the endangered cheetahs that belong to the National Zoo. They're part of what's called a species survival plan, a coordinated effort to protect and breed groups of cheetahs that have strong enough genetics to be able to survive on their own in Africa. Researchers here get to work with a wide range of endangered species, from North Africa's scimitar horned oryx, which are now extinct in the wild, to one of South America's most beautiful predators, maned wolves. This facility is closed to the public. But some animals at Front Royal also spend time at the National Zoo in Washington, so the public can see these species up close and better learn about the efforts to protect them. But on the afternoon of August 23, 2011, keepers here at the National Zoo noticed some strange behavior. The beavers suddenly stopped eating. The pink flamingos seemed strangely agitated and then started clustering together. And one of the zoo's elephants, Shanti, made a loud noise with her trunk, which she only does when she gets excited. Moments later, at 1:51 p.m., a violent 5.8 earthquake rocked Washington, D.C., giving residents and the creatures at the zoo a terrifying shake. The epicenter was the town of Mineral, Virginia, nearly 90 miles away. It lies in what's known as the Virginia Seismic Zone. The 2011 quake was the most widely felt of any earthquake in U.S. history. Its shockwaves rocked Washington, D.C. for about 30 seconds. When it was over, the towering National Cathedral had $26 million in damage. And down in the National Mall, engineers were soon rappelling down the face of the Washington Monument and finding dangerous cracks in the facade. It had to be closed for almost 3 years for repairs. The monument finally reopened in 2014. Today, once again, more than 800,000 people climb its stairs every year for a chance to see the nation's capital and its monuments from high above. What they can't see from here is a little piece of evidence of just how long it took to build the monument they're standing in. Construction began in 1848, but 6 years into the project, the private society that commissioned it ran out of money. And then the Civil War arrived, and it stood unfinished for more than 2 decades. When Congress finally agreed to fund and finish the project in 1876, marble from the original quarry was no longer available. Look closely at the Washington Monument today, and it's possible to see the faint line where the original pre-Civil War construction stopped and where the work started again with new money and new marble in 1879. Just one more piece of evidence that Washington, D.C. wasn't built overnight, and that many of its landmarks have a history almost as old as the nation. But D.C. has its share of modern landmarks too, especially here on the banks of the Potomac. In 1965, a brand new luxury apartment complex was completed here, just east of Georgetown. It was funded in part by the investment arm of the Vatican and named Watergate. Little did anyone know that Watergate would become a household name across the nation. Thanks to what happened here 7 years later, early one Saturday morning in 1972. At 2:30 a.m. on June 17, 1972, a security guard at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. happened to notice that some of the locks in the building had been tampered with. He called the police, who soon caught 5 men breaking into the offices of the Democratic National Committee on the 6th floor of Watergate's Central Tower. They also had bags of wiretapping equipment, and their pockets were lined with $100 bills. It was a small burglary, but was about to snowball into the biggest political scandal in the nation's history. When the sun rose over the city later that morning, 2 young reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were assigned to investigate the crime. They worked for the Washington Post in offices here, just a few blocks from the White House. 2 days later, they reported that one of the burglars worked for the committee to re-elect President Richard Nixon. Within months, Woodward and Bernstein had uncovered a money trail linking payments from members of Nixon's re-election campaign to the burglars. Despite Nixon's landslide re-election, all 3 branches of government were soon deeply involved in the Watergate story. On Capitol Hill, members of Congress called for a full inquiry. Down on Pennsylvania Avenue, at the Justice Department, the FBI was conducting its own investigation and beginning to prosecute the burglars. At the White House, Nixon and his administration worked hard to explain the ever-increasing evidence of a cover-up. Meanwhile, the Washington Post and other media outlets carried the Watergate story to the world. But one of the most important locations in the investigation of the Watergate scandal was a well-guarded secret. It lay just across the Potomac River in Roslyn, Virginia. It was here, in a parking garage below an office complex, that Woodward came to meet secretly with a government informant, famously identified only as Deep Throat. For 2 years, as the Watergate story unfolded, disturbing new evidence came to light about Nixon's role in the cover-up. On July 24, 1974, the judges of the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the White House had to turn over the Nixon tapes to Congress. These recordings were the smoking gun that finally caused many on Capitol Hill, including high-ranking members of Nixon's own Republican Party, to pressure him to step down. Finally, on August 8th, here in the White House, Nixon resigned instead of being forced from office. He never admitted to any of the high crimes or misdemeanors with which he was about to be charged, and was given a full pardon by his successor, President Gerald Ford, 1 month later. But 25 members of Nixon's administration were convicted and given jail time. It wasn't until 2005 that the identity of the Washington Post source, Deep Throat, was revealed. He was the deputy director of the FBI at the time, Mark Felt. There have been any number of political scandals in Washington since Nixon, but the Watergate scandal was the first major event to make Americans question the ethics of their elected officials, and it sowed the seeds of cynicism about government that still exist today. While he was in office, President Richard Nixon was a fervent fan of the Washington Redskins, who played across town at RFK Stadium, here behind the U.S. Capitol. In 1996, the team moved from RFK to a new stadium in Maryland that's now known as FedEx Field. The Redskins actually started out in Boston as the Braves, but changed names to the Redskins after they started sharing Boston's Fenway Park with the Boston Red Sox. The Redskins later moved to Washington in 1937. But today, the team is facing a growing controversy about its own name. Native American groups and a growing number of others say the name Redskins is a racial slur. Some major media outlets refuse to use the name in their reporting. Continued protests and even half the members of the U.S. Senate have pressured the team's current owner, Dan Snyder, to come up with a new name, but so far, he's refused. This isn't the first controversy for the Redskins. It was the last team in the NFL to add an African-American player to its roster. The team's owner at the time, George Preston Marshall, simply refused. The U.S. government finally told Marshall he had to hire black players, or the team would be barred from RFK Stadium. He finally relented during the 1962 draft and signed up African-American running back and wide receiver Bobby Mitchell, who went on to win a place in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Marshall's refusal to hire black players was especially controversial because the majority of Washington, D.C.'s population was African American. In 1900, there were more blacks in Washington by percentage than any other American city. By 1957, they made up more than 50% of the city's population. But recently, that's been changing. In 2011, D.C.'s African American population dropped below 50%, and tens of thousands of black residents have left the city in the last decade, thanks in large part to rising rents and gentrification. One part of town that's witnessed this dramatic change is this one, the Shaw neighborhood, which lies in D.C.'s northwest quadrant. It got its start as a Union Army camp for freed slaves and went on to become the cultural heart of Washington, D.C.'s African-American community. It got a big boost in 1867, just a few years after the end of the Civil War, when Howard University opened its doors. Howard went on to graduate a long list of African-American leaders, from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, to writer and Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, to opera singer Jesse Norman, to music producer Sean Combs, also known as P. Diddy, who dropped out before graduation but returned for an honorary degree in 2014. In the early 20th century, the Shaw's main avenue, U Street, was known as Black Broadway. Today, its historic Lincoln Theater is still standing. Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, and local D.C. jazz great Duke Ellington all performed at the Lincoln. Today, some have called this neighborhood a mini United Nations, thanks to the wide range of nationalities that now call the Shaw neighborhood home. But no matter where you live in Washington, there's one interesting fact that unites every D.C. resident. They all live within sight of the U.S. Capitol, and they all pay federal income taxes, but they don't have a vote in Congress. When the nation's capital was created under the Constitution, it was also decided that Congress would govern it directly, and it's been that way ever since. So there's no such thing as a Washington, D.C. senator on Capitol Hill. They've had to file their grievances instead here at City Hall, which is one reason their license plate reads, "Taxation without representation." It's one more example of how Washington, D.C. is unlike any other city in America, where the rich history of a nation is there to discover just about everywhere you look. From the banks of its rivers, to its halls of power, to the battlefields where its freedom was fiercely defended, and the angled pinnacle of its tallest tower. There is simply no other place like the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C.